Welcome to your lecture on the Civil War. If you have your student notes handy, use them to follow along or to fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Tensions between the North and the South had been steadily rising throughout the early and mid-1800s. The root issue? Slavery. Abraham Lincoln warned the country that a house divided cannot stand. Yet those tensions continued to intensify, and after the presidential election of 1860, when Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, that divided house began to topple. South Carolina was the first to go. On December 20th of 1860, she seceded or withdrew from the United States. And in April of 1861, South Carolina troops fired on Fort Sumter, thus beginning the American Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history. The American Civil War raged between 1861 and 1865, and in those 4 long years, more than 620,000 Americans died, more than in almost all other American wars combined. The stakes were high. If the South won the war, she would earn the ability to leave the United States and form her own country, the Confederate States of America. If the North won, the South would not be able to secede, and the country would remain whole and unified. Now, the Union had a lot of advantages heading into the Civil War. The first one was population. There were fully 2.5 times more people living in the North than in the South at the beginning of the Civil War. More people means bigger armies. The North's second advantage was that it had industrialized. There were lots of factories in the North that could make important supplies for soldiers on the battlefield. Moreover, because there were so many railroads and trains, it was pretty easy to carry those supplies from the factories to the soldiers who needed them. Trains could also carry soldiers quickly and efficiently from one location to another. The North was led by President Abraham Lincoln, a thoughtful, deeply religious, humble, and honest man. He was born in a log cabin, and in all had only about 18 months of formal schooling. All of you are familiar with homeschooling. Well, Abraham Lincoln homeschooled himself. He taught himself how to read and write, and he studied so hard and so well that he even became a lawyer. Now, of course, before he became a lawyer, he held a series of odd jobs. And it was at one of those, at a store, that he earned one of his most famous nicknames. You see, one day, while Abraham Lincoln was working at the store, he accidentally overcharged a customer by a little bit. Not much. Overcharging a customer was an easy mistake to make in those days without cash registers or calculators, and it was only after the customer had gone home that Abraham Lincoln realized his mistake. As I said, he didn't overcharge him by much, but Abraham Lincoln was not one to let such a mistake slide. So he hiked 6 miles to that customer's house to return the extra change. That dedication to honesty earned him the nickname Honest Abe. Honest Abe thought of the United States as being one big family. He didn't want to go to war. You don't go to war against your family. He wanted to find a peaceful way to resolve the differences between the North and the South. But when South Carolina forced Abraham Lincoln's hand by firing on Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln did go to war, and he led the North courageously and wisely. The South didn't have all the advantages that the North did going into the war. They had a much smaller population, and they didn't have nearly the same number of factories or railroads. What they did have was excellent generals. Some of the best generals in the entire United States were from the South. And generals are critical to the success of any army because they're the ones telling people where to go and what to do. It was because of the excellence of the South's generals that the Confederacy was able to hold on as long as it did. The South had another advantage too. Its soldiers knew how to shoot. Our image of the South is of sprawling cotton plantations manned by hundreds of slaves, but in fact, most farms in the South were small and most farmers poor. That meant that sometimes the food they were able to get wasn't enough and they had to hunt for food. All of that hunting made them excellent shots. And you know what's easier to shoot than a squirrel or a rabbit? A Union soldier. The third advantage the Confederacy had was motivation. Soldiers in the South felt like they were fighting for their homes, their families, their values, and that motivation helped them do their absolute best on the battlefield, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The main general of the Confederate Army was a dignified and honorable gentleman named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was the picture of a general. He kept his gray uniform pristine. He had a lovely beard and a commanding manner. His men loved him, and he loved them too. He also loved animals. His horse Traveler went everywhere with him, and after Robert E. Lee died, Traveler died 2 months later, and the two were buried near each other at Washington and Lee University. Robert E. Lee was known for his bold attacks. He was very aggressive in his tactics. He was also famous for understanding the mind of his enemy. He could understand what other generals were going to do and act accordingly. Between his bold tactics, his understanding of the enemy, and the support of many other excellent generals, Robert E. Lee was able to win battles even when outnumbered 2-1. It's no surprise then that in the early years of the war, the South was actually winning. Northern generals were terrified of Robert E. Lee, and the North was beginning to wonder if it could win this war after all. Abraham Lincoln, looking at the situation, said to himself, "I need better generals." And so he hunted through his army and he found General Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, along with a couple other excellent Union generals, were able to turn the tide in the North's favor. They started winning battles and beating the Confederates back. Another reason why the Confederacy began to falter was that their lack of factories and supplies was beginning to catch up with them. They had been okay for the first couple of years, but they now found themselves unable to sustain a longer war. They were running out of supplies, they were running out of men. Even when they won battles, in a way they lost because when their soldiers died, they had no one to replace them. They were running out of food. They were having to forage in the countryside to find edible grasses and roots to eat. They didn't have shoes. They were cold, tired, and hungry. It's hard enough to fight in a war. It's even harder when you're doing it on an empty stomach and bare feet. And the third reason for the South's defeat was the breaking of their morale. Morale is the desire to keep fighting. As I said, Southern soldiers felt, at least in the beginning, they had a lot of reasons to fight. They were fighting for their homes and their families. But you have all these battles occurring on Southern soil. And Southern soldiers are seeing their homes and their fields burned, their cities leveled. Southern civilians, non-soldiers too, are seeing the destruction and havoc wreaked across their beautiful countryside, their way of life disappearing, and they too begin to long for peace. Before the war ends, however, I'd like to take you back to January 1st of 1863 and one of the most important events of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a decree by President Abraham Lincoln that set free all the slaves living in the Confederate States. Wait a minute, I hear you say. The Confederate States? Weren't they trying to break away and form their own country? Why would they listen to anything the president said? You're right, they didn't. They looked at him and said, "Abraham Lincoln, make laws for your own country." But after the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation did take effect, and all the slaves in those former Confederate states were set free. The Emancipation Proclamation had another effect. Everyone knew that slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, but the Emancipation Proclamation made it official. Everyone, North and South, now knew that the war was officially about slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation had another effect as well. It enabled escaped slaves from the South to become soldiers in the Union Army. And these soldiers fought so bravely and so tenaciously for their country that they began to change racist attitudes in the North. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. The war was over. Hooray! Positive effects of the end of the war and the Northern victory were that the South remained part of the United States. That's why you don't need a passport if you want to go visit relatives in South Carolina. Another major positive effect was the end of slavery. When the war ended, that Emancipation Proclamation took effect and all the slaves in the Southern states were set free. 8 months later, the 13th Amendment would outlaw slavery in all of the United States, and the remaining slaves in the northern states that had slavery still would be set free. Not everything was rosy, however. At the end of the Civil War, the South was in ruins. Cities had been leveled, fields and homes burned, countryside and the economy destroyed. There was a lot to rebuild. And frankly, the North wasn't in that great shape either. The North had had to borrow a lot of money to sustain the war effort and was left with enormous war debts that it now had to figure out how to pay. Now that the war was over, it was time for the South and the North to figure out how they were going to heal the divide between them and rebuild. That's all for today. See you next week.